Hi, and welcome to today's Daily Chronicle. Today is Thursday, April 2nd, 2026. Is the U.S. Navy ready to clear sea mines in the Persian Gulf? On the ongoing war with the United States and Israel, Iran has been threatening to mine the vital Strait of Hormuz, with reports suggesting it may have already placed devices in the narrow shipping choke point. It has set the stage for a possible complex and risky U.S. Navy operation to reopen the waterway using new mine clearing technology. On Tuesday, Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth said the U.S. was taking steps to reopen the Strait of the Hormuz, but did not say what measures were being taken. The U.S. Fifth Fleet, based in Bahrain, has also posted videos showing strikes against Iran's navy, including what it says are mine-laying vessels. Mines pose a significant threat to the tankers and other commercial shipping vessels that pass through the strait. They are also a serious danger to warships. Since World War II, sea mines have caused a disproportionate share of damage to U.S. Navy vessels, sinking or crippling 15 of them. More than from all other weapons combined. These incidents include 3 U.S. warships damaged by sea mines in the Persian Gulf since 1988, and that injured dozens of sailors. Despite the danger, however, mine warfare, which encompasses both the deployment and clearance of naval mines, has received minimal attention and funding from the Navy, overshadowed by higher-profile weapons systems, according to maritime security expert Scott C. Truver. Funding for mine warfare accounts for less than 1% of the Navy's total budget, he says. Some people call it a stepchild of the U.S. Navy, he says. Switching to the LCS. Just as Iranian sea mines are again a threat to the Persian Gulf, the Navy is in the midst of retiring its older wooden-hulled Avenger-class ships that have been used since the 1980s for minesweeping. They're being replaced by the Independence class of littoral combat ships, which rely on unmanned systems and helicopters to find and destroy them. The U.S. is investing in uncrewed systems to do this mission instead, according to Brian Clark, a senior fellow at the Hudson Institute, a center-right think tank focuses on national security and defense policy. All the LCS ships have to do is stand clear of the minefield and then allow their neutralization, he says. But the LCS have suffered from development delays, cost overruns, and other problems that have earned them the epithet, little crappy ship, from critics. A 2022 report from the Government Accountability Office noted several significant challenges with the LCS, including the ship's ability to defend itself if it attacked and failure rates of mission-essential equipment. But whether the Navy's replacement is really ready is an open question. Weeks ago, 2 Independence-class LCS ships, the USS Santa Barbara and the USS Tulsa, were in Singapore. A third, the USS Canberra, is equipped with mine countermeasures packages, but is also in Asia. Emma Salisbury, a senior fellow at the Foreign Policy Research Institute, says she is honestly completely baffled as to why the Navy wouldn't have mine-clearing resources near the Middle East at the start of the conflict. Having a mine countermeasures capability that is not in theater is not particularly helpful, she says. NATO allies may be better prepared than the U.S. Trump has repeatedly called on NATO allies to provide ships to help secure the strait. On Tuesday, Hegseth chastised other countries, making a veiled reference to Britain in particular, for not doing more. Those countries have largely declined to help. When it comes to mine clearance, the U.S. Navy is in a bit of a bind. Salisbury says she notes that many European nations are better equipped for this task than the U.S. Poland, for instance, has more than 24 mine clearing ships in its fleet, and the UK, France, and Turkey also have sizable numbers of such vessels. And in past decades, the U.S. has turned to these nations for help. In the Gulf War and the Iraq War, Salisbury says the U.S. has relied on European NATO allies to provide mine clearing capability. Meanwhile, the new mine hunting and clearing system, with the LCS at its core, remains unproven. The MCM package, which integrates unmanned surface and underwater vehicles, MH-60S helicopters, and sonar systems, is designed to detect, identify, and neutralize sea mines, but it has yet to be demonstrated under real-world conditions. In a report released in March, the Pentagon's Director of Operational Test and Evaluation and the office responsible for assessing the effectiveness of military systems noted that in the fiscal year 2025, the Navy conducted no operational testing of the Independence Variant Littoral Combat Ship equipped with the Mine Countermeasures MCM mission package. The director added that operational effectiveness cannot determine operational effectiveness due to insufficient performance data. Salisbury describes herself as an LCS critic. She says that at best, the mine countermeasures technology on these ships is a question mark. What worries me is not necessarily can it work once or twice, but can it work over and over at the tempo that would be needed? If only LCS ships were being used, she says. A dirty and dangerous job. Retired Admin James Fogo, Dean of the Center for Maritime Strategy, says past experiences has shown that mines should be one of the Navy's top priorities. Mines tend to be an asymmetric weapon, he says. They also tend to be a poor man's tool to exert pressure on larger, more powerful nations. Mine clearing is a dirty and dangerous job that is also time-consuming. Truver says a single device can take hours to clear, and in the meantime, you're essentially standing still while operations are underway. You're essentially performing controlled explosions for each individual mine, Salisbury says. Your ships are going to be in that dangerous area for a long time. Ideally, then, mine clearance would begin after hostilities in Iran end. Citron says, but the conditions would still be fraught. He notes that in the 1980s, minesweepers had to operate while commercial ships and even larger frigates risked striking mines. Destroying them is just one hurdle, though. Before minesweepers head in, says Fogo, there will need to be a combat air patrol in place above the strait. After minesweepers do their work, destroyers would be sent in to escort oil tankers. If that effort began today, it would still take a month to get underway, he says. Trump has insisted that European nations find a military way to open that waterway. Addressing them this week, you'll have to learn how to fight for yourself. The USA won't be there to help you anymore, just like you weren't there for us, he said. Iran has essentially been decimated. The hard part is done. Go get your own oil. But Europe doesn't have the military resources, such as aircraft refueling tankers or the necessary naval forces. Any large military operation to open the strait would likely require a joint effort, led by the U.S. If all goes well, Fogo says he has every confidence that shipping lanes through the strait could be cleared relatively quickly. We're a very professional force, and it's a big challenge, he acknowledges. People just need to have strategic and tactical patience. This is a portion of my cast class of the book Learning to Lead. Learning to advocate. Mafalda was born with a floating spine. He had a condition called sacral agenesis, which meant, among other things, that he was missing the lower part of his spine, 3 vertebrae and a tailbone. Doctors in Guadalajara, Mexico, where Mafalda and his twin brother were born, determined that Mafalda would never be able to walk or even sit up. He would spend his entire life laying down. Mafalda's parents, Yolanda and Antonio, were devastated. When the initial shock of the diagnosis faded, however, they began to look for second opinions and solutions. It was 1994, and they lived in one of the biggest metropolitan areas in Mexico, second only to Mexico City. They believed that there had to be other options. During the first several months of Mafalda's life, Yolanda and Antonio paid thousands of dollars to specialists in and around Guadalajara, but none of them could give them any answers. Then Yolanda's sister, who lives in the United States, found out about a children's hospital that specialized in orthopedics and spinal cord injuries, Shriners Hospital for Children in Los Angeles. Mafalda's parents scheduled an appointment and traveled with him to the United States for a consultation. The doctors at Shriners Hospital offered Yolanda and Antonio hope. Though they wouldn't be a single solution, a series of surgeries would help Mafalda's mobility and strength. Medical specialists proposed multiple operations, recovery periods, and follow-up visits during his early childhood development. Periodic procedures would be necessary as long as Mafalda's bones continued to grow. While such a course of treatment seemed daunting, the expense was not. They learned that Shriners Hospital offered medical services free of charge to children up to the age of 18, regardless of the family's immigration status. When they understood the scope of the proposed treatment and realized that the hospital offered affordable access to care that was not available in their home country, Yolanda and Antonio knew they would need to move their small family to Los Angeles. They were a young married couple starting their life together. Yolanda worked for a Mexican airline, and Antonio worked at a travel agency. They had a stable middle-class life in Guadalajara. They used their airline benefits to travel across the country and into the United States to see their favorite bands in concert. Soda Stereo in Mexico City, UT in Miami. They owned a home. The priority now, however, was to do whatever they could so that Mafalda could gain enough mobility to enjoy his life. The couple quit their jobs, sold their homes, and moved to the Inland Empire, east of Los Angeles, where they could be near family and within driving distance of the hospital. Mafalda and his twin brother were 1 year old. Yolanda immediately found work cleaning houses, and Antonio even eventually found a job at a travel agency. They struggled to adjust to their new lives in Southern California. Once middle-class professionals, they were now working-class migrants. Though they spoke some English, it was not their dominant language. Exasperating matters was the upsurge of a hostile climate for immigrants in California, fostered by the governor P. Wilson. When Yolanda and Antonio first arrived in Los Angeles for their consultation with the Shriners doctors, Wilson had recently been reelected on a strong anti-immigration platform. A key part of that was his support for Proposition 187, the so-called Save Our State initiative, when would which would have denied unauthorized immigrants access to non-emergency health care and public education, among other services. Fortunately for Yolanda and Antonio, that law would have applied only to hospitals that received state funding. Shriners did not. Though the proposition itself was ultimately found to be unconstitutional, Latino advocacy groups noted an upsurge in anti-Latino violence and aggression in the months following the 1994 election, when voters passed Proposition 187. It was this political climate that Yolanda and Antonio unsuccessfully attempted to extend their families' tourist visas and petitioned for legal permanent residency. Meanwhile, Mafalda was receiving the medical care that they had hoped for. Against the initial prognosis they received from doctors in Mexico, Mafalda had taken his first steps by the time he was 3. Yolanda and Antonio were determined to see how far the course of treatment at Shriners could take their child. When their tourist visas expired, they decided to stay in Los Angeles, and Yolanda, Antonio Mafalda, and his twin became undocumented. Over the next several years, Yolanda was able to capitalize on her education in Mexico to find a white-collar job and began work as an accountant for a chain of Mexican grocery stores. Antonio's steadiest work was as a newspaper carrier, which he was able to supplement from time to time with other part-time jobs. When Mafalda was old enough to go to school, they decided to enroll him in a school for children with disabilities. In this context, they could be certain that teachers and staff would be able to support Mafalda's academic development and his unique physiological needs. After 2 years, Yolanda and Antonio decided that Mafalda was ready to attend a mainstream school. Though Mafalda would still need some physical assistance, his parents wanted him to develop social and navigational skills that would help him lead an independent life. The transition was difficult. While teachers and staff at the first school were specially trained to support children with disabilities, staff and faculty at the new school were untrained and sometimes unwilling to help Mafalda, even when he could articulate exactly what he needed. Yolanda was a constant fixture at the school, advocating for her child. She took her concerns to the principal, and when the principal was unresponsive, she went to the superintendent. She made sure that teachers and school nurses knew how to manage Mafalda's situation. Guided by an awareness that schools might dismiss her child's needs because he came from an immigrant family, Yolanda was almost aggressive in her approach. She had left her life behind in Mexico to save her child's life. She was not going to leave Mafalda's education to chance. It was precisely this desire that led Yolanda and Antonio, when Mafalda was poised to enter high school, to enroll him at International Polytechnic School, iPoly, in Pomona, California. Though it was a public school, iPoly operated almost like a private school, maintaining a small size, about 500 students, in the entire high school, and an innovative curriculum, which it characterized as entirely college prep. The school did not charge tuition, but students had to pass an entrance exam and meet a grade point average enrollment requirement to enroll. Mafalda easily met the admissions requirements and genuinely felt an immense sense of belonging to the school. As a person with a disability from an immigrant background, and ultimately as someone who identified as queer, while Yolanda and Antonio were happy that Mafalda was doing well, both academically and socially at iPoly, what was particularly appealing was iPoly's offering of a dual college enrollment for junior and senior students who met certain academic standards during their freshman and sophomore years. If all went well, Mafalda would be able to earn college credit. During high school without the family incurring the expense of college tuition. At the end of Mafalda's sophomore year of high school, the life that Yolanda and Antonio had vigilantly and carefully created for them. NASA's Artemis II craft meets the launch pad ahead of crewed lunar orbit. The NASA spacecraft set to take Americans on a journey around the moon. As part of the agency's Artemis II mission reached its launch pad on Saturday evening at the agency's Kennedy Space Center in Florida. The integrated SLS Space Launch System rocket and Orion spacecraft, which will hold the 4 astronauts flying the mission, arrived at launch pad 39B just before 7 p.m. The 4-mile trek to ferry the 11 million pound rocket stack from the vehicle assembly building took nearly 12 hours. The goal of the Artemis program is to eventually send Americans to the moon for the first time in more than 50 years, with the long-term goal of achieving missions to Mars. The architecture you see behind us here with the SLS and the Orion spacecraft is just the beginning, NASA's director, Jared Isaacman, told the reporters early Saturday. Now, over time, launching missions like this, we are going to learn a lot, and the vehicle architecture will change. And as it changes, we should be able to undertake repeatable, affordable missions to and from the moon. The lunar launch could be staged as early as February 6, depending on team and rocket readiness. The craft's 4 astronauts, Christina Koch, Victor Clover, Reed Wiseman, and Canadian Space Agency astronaut Jeremy Hansen, will first orbit Earth before traveling around the moon. The journey is expected to take 10 days. The launch of Artemis II follows the original Artemis launch, which sent a crewless craft into space in 2022. What the lunar orbit would teach its onboard scientists, Isaacman said, is what's going to enable missions like Artemis 100 and beyond, adding that he hoped the mission would inspire future generations of astronauts as well. Why are we doing this? We are doing this to fulfill a promise to the American people that we will return to the moon. Meet the NASA astronauts headed to the moon. In this handout provided by NASA astronauts Reed Wiseman, Artemis II commander, left Victor Glover, Artemis II pilot, Christina Koch, Artemis II mission specialist, and CSA, Canadian Space Agency, astronaut Jeremy Hansen. Artemis II mission specialist, right? Stop for group photograph as they visit NASA's Artemis II SLS Space Launch System, rocket, and Orion spacecraft on March 30th, 2026 in Cape Canaveral, Florida. NASA is aiming for an early April launch date for the first crewed moon mission in 50 years. The quest to reach the moon has always been a key part of American myth. So has the country's embrace of immigrants and its vision of itself as a defender of democracy around the world. On a day all 3 are in play, we'll meet the crew headed out toward the moon.